If transrational truth is the answer, as you said, then why do you think it's not ultimately and satisfactorily universally manifested, since that is so important?
The transcendental truth, you mean, where in the person of God transcending humanity?
Like you said earlier when you said that the answer is it not in secularism, but going beyond the world view, having God.
Okay, if I'm understanding your question correctly, let me position it this way. Are you asking me if that is the way that it should be?
Correct.
Why is it not universally experienced or felt or sensed within humanity?
Exactly.
Okay. I think that's a very fair question. I think it's a good question. But it is felt. It is felt in strange ways. We do not realize it. For example, the strongest argument against the existence of God is that people say there is too much of evil in this world and too much of suffering, therefore there is no God. But can you not then see what is brought in through the back door in that question? Because if there's evil, there's good. If there's good, there has to be a moral law. If there's a moral law, there has to be a transcendent moral lawgiver, but that's whom the question is trying to disprove and not prove. Because if there's no moral lawgiver, there's no moral law. If there's no moral law, there's no good. If there's no good, there's no evil. What is the question, really? So the strongest argument against the existence of God actually assumes God in the question. So it is universally manifested. What actually happens is, your question is so profound if you really think about it. You have to sort of take off one layer at a time. So let me put it this way. When Paul stood before the Athenians, he spoke to them about the fact that they were religious within their worldview. They had all these places and altars for all kinds of gods, and just in case they'd missed any, they also put an unknown God. In India today, in the pantheon of Hinduism, there are 330 million deities. Islam, with its billion-plus followers, believes in a supreme being. Even Buddhism, though it is non-theistic in its essence, you will find them in strange ways sometimes talking about Buddha as if he is that transcendent eternal being with you. There is an inescapable, it's what I think Blake would call that disturbing presence that is there hovering over you. The problem comes not in the disregard for this ultimate reality. The problem comes in the particulars then that we start attributing to this reality and configure a worldview that is religious without worrying about the notion of testability and truth. You know, it is interesting. Richard Dawkins has gone the route of saying there's no such thing as good or evil. It is ultimately all of us dancing to our DNA. And in this whole field of neuroscience, which is possibly going to be the most significant discipline in years to come, people are talking about, is it all in our DNA? Is it all in our DNA? Is it all in our DNA? The more I pondered that, there's a lot we need to think about in that statement. Because if you go to some cultures where for centuries there's been a kind of idolatry, how can you expect somebody who in the 20th or 30th generation is suddenly going to dismantle and throw everything away from centuries of belief in a certain system of deities or whatever it is? And the more I pondered that, the more I came to the realization, if indeed it is in our DNA, partially, how much truer then is the statement that Jesus made that you must be born again? That only in the regeneration of God. The Bible says that God is spoken in the created order, that he is spoken in the inner voice of conscience, that he is spoken in the written revelation of his word, that through instrumentalities and through punctuated means God does speak. The problem is what Chesterton, for example, says. The problem with Christianity is not that it's been tried and found wanting, but that it's been found difficult and left untried. So we have sufficient data. Bertrand Russell, when he was asked why he disbelieved in God, he said, I would say to him, you did not give me enough evidence. The problem with Mr. Russell was not that he didn't have enough evidence, but it was the suppression of evidence that he engaged in all the time. I think God gives us enough of revelation in himself. Our problem is not that it is not manifested, but that we want to wrest it, to reinterpret it, and make ourselves completely sovereign over it. And that's, I think, the human heart. That's what it is.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with your concept of absolute truth. My problem is recognizing that truth. And further, when you say recognizing that truth from God, I would assume it would come as a piece of spirit, or the spirit testifying, or whatever rhetoric you may use. How do you say to a Buddhist who has that peace or that recognition, or a Hindu or a Muslim who believe that they got that answer from that higher power, that theirs is not valid while the Christian's viewpoint is valid?
Very, very great question. And you're dealing, of course, with two levels of interaction. Level one, that's why I think most of modern day attempts to communicate the person of Christ or the message of Christ falls on deaf ears, because it is going through a paradigm that has not yet been challenged. For example, if a Hindu legitimately believes in his mind that all religions are right, that there's no one way to God, no matter what you say about Christ, he or she will add it to that paradigm. They just almost, it's sort of sucking in every worldview, because the scaffolding says it has a rightness to it and fits in with the rest of what I believe. I don't have to disbelieve anything in order to believe this. Suppose the Hindu believed that. Then to give the particulars of Christ is only to add to an erroneous worldview. We in America at a certain stage could talk about Christ without any such entanglement of other worldviews, and the person would understand it. In a few minutes they say, I now fathom it, what do I do, how do I get right with God, and so on. But we are now in the complexity of a pluralistic and a relativistic culture with many worldviews in the mix. And if you do the communication of truth without understanding the other worldview, it'll really be falling on deaf ears. And I think it is absolutely imperative that the communication of truth today should first be in terms of the worldview of the individual, that you understand it. For example, I go to India at least 2 or 3 times a year. I speak to large Hindu audiences. And this recently when I was there, some well-known film actors, big name icons were in my audience. And they were listening very, very carefully. And at the end of it, one of them said to me, one of them actually literally came and fell at my feet. I picked him up. I said, no, please don't do that. He said, I really need to talk to you. There is so much I have believed over the years that I don't know why I believed. He understood what I was saying was that if something is added here, something will have to be subtracted from what we believe. So when we say our absolute is based on the Judeo-Christian worldview, and you're talking to a Muslim or a Buddhist or a Hindu who does not subscribe to the worldview, there's no point really talking to them about absolutes without first talking to them about why they believe what they believe. And so it involves a 2-step process. You cannot convey, and here's the point. Jesus Christ didn't come into this world to make bad people good. He came into this world to make dead people live. We are dead to God. Being more moral is not going to, D.L. Moody used to say, if a man is stealing nuts and bolts from a railway track and you send him to college, at the end of his education, he will steal the whole railway track. Giving absolutes is not going to change a person's life. What we need to do is find the basis of the absolute, and that's where I think true communication of absolutes presupposes a worldview that needs to be in place. I think that's very important. It's tough. I remember talking to a woman in Bangkok who was the first woman to be ordained in Buddhism in Thailand. She was a PhD from McMaster University in Hamilton, Ontario, and went back to Thailand, and she had to go to Sri Lanka to be ordained. And I remember as I kept pinning her on question after question after question, there were 2 things she struggled with. Number 1, that to truly attain nirvana, she had to renounce every attachment in the world. I said, so ma'am, Your advice to me today is that really I should turn my back upon my wife and my children. Is that what you're asking me to do? Because that's what you've done to your family. Her lips quivered and the tears started to run down her face. I kid you not. She said, I still struggle with it. She never answered me. And then a few other questions, she came out with another startling response. To her, only in the end of our 3 hours did I tell her how I came to know Christ in my life. And she was silent at that time. Worldview evangelism is here today. And the absolute into a relativistic world that just adds without subtracting is to leave the absolute relativized after you're finished. It doesn't work.